Welcome back to Strange Exiles and to the second of an ongoing series of special collaborations with Revol Press. Over the coming months, as I said on the first of these collaborations, I'll be interviewing existing and upcoming Revol authors. Be sure to check out the first one, which featured Gareth Stewart Farmer, author of the forthcoming book, Writing Autism. Today, my guest is Faure Walker, a writer, theorist, and lately an ecotherapist and practitioner of Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing. As an academic, activist, and educator, Rob worked at UCL and SOAS, as well as inner city London schools. As an activist, he was a leading critic of the UK's government counter-terrorist prevent programme designed to combat domestic extremism. And we'll talk a little bit about that during the show. His first two books are 2024's Love and the Market on Economics and the Enlightenment, and 2022's The Emergence of Extremism. Rob returns this year with Radical Jung, Emancipatory Politics, and the Search for Meaning in the Ruins of Late Capitalism for Revol Press. Rob, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm great, thanks. Thanks for having me on here.
No, absolutely a pleasure. And where are you calling in from today?
So I'm based in North Wiltshire. So I lived in London for 20 years and then moved out here, fortunately for me, just before the pandemic. And it was, usual story. In London for 20 years, was working mostly in school as a teacher in schools and then latterly in universities. And when I had two young kids, I suddenly found that I wasn't engaging in the main attractions of London, which is kind of, I guess, the night economy. And so it's kind of time to get out and find some space and give my kids some fresh air. And actually, there's the thing that drove us out, which is kind of related to some of your work on the Darkest Timeline, I guess, was my wife and I had been kind of discussing whether to move out or not. She's originally Malaysian from Kuala Lumpur, so the idea of moving to the English countryside was pretty alien to her. And it was when Boris Johnson lost the mayoral elections and Sadiq Khan released 5 years of clean air data or dirty air data about London, which Boris Johnson had been hiding from the public. And we kind of looked at this. And we're like, well, there is literally no way of not damaging our children by staying here. And that was the kind of thing that drove us out. Was this kind of, there was a kind of hard data point that actually we're just going to get out now. Which is, we're sort of privileged enough to be able to do that. And initially this is one of those big shifts that happened through the pandemic, that when we first moved out of London, we were both commuting for like an hour and a half to get back into London. For me, a couple of times a week, my wife 3 or 4 times a week. And now, largely working from home, going to offices. My wife goes to an office a couple of times a week, but it's kind of unimaginable to go back to that world of those like massive commutes and stuff. It's just I don't know. We sort of gloss over it, but it was a very, very different place before the pandemic.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, in my day job, they've just forced us back to the office for 40% of the time, and I'm still sort of like champing at the bit a little bit about having to do that. Definitely, that did feel like a different world being able to work from home from the pandemic. Oh, that's great. Well, listen, we're going to kick off by talking a little bit about your book, which, as I said, is called Radical Jung. It's got a fantastic cover and is available for pre-order now from Revol Press. So I wondered if I could just kick off by asking you, why is now the time for a book about Carl Jung? What kind of ideas can he offer us in this particular moment?
Yeah, I think, this is going to have to be, I'm going to have to answer this personally, but then how that relates more broadly politically. So I was, up until the point of starting to write this book, or maybe up till the book I wrote before this, I was very, very engaged in activist politics, particularly, and I guess I'll give a bit of a narrative how I got into that. I was teaching in a school in Tower Hamlets in East London. And that school was about 98% Bangladeshi Muslim kids. And I don't know if your kind of listeners will be that familiar with the Trojan Horse affair in Birmingham, which is where Michael Gove, who in my opinion has been the kind of the leader of Islamophobia, the sort of Islamophobia from the government in this country, from successive governments in this country, he created this moral panic around the schools in Birmingham, suggesting that the schools had been taken over by Islamic extremists, and then sent in the government's ex-head of counter-terrorism to do these assessments of the schools, who, you know, someone whose job it is to spot potential terrorists, came back and gave this kind of damning report, but the reality of it is, and this is from my experience of having spent quite a lot of time with the people that were affected by it, I've spent time in Birmingham with the schools. I've even spent time embedded with counter-terrorism teams when I was doing some research in Birmingham. So I've met a lot of the people involved in the Trojan Horse, and a lot of the teachers and head teachers whose careers were ruined by it. And what was actually happening was that, much like the school I was working in Tower Hamlets, there had been an effort over a couple of decades at least to make the schools representative of the communities they served. So you had these predominantly Asian Muslim communities, and the criticism of people like Michael Gove was that the governing bodies of these schools and the leadership teams of these schools have been taken over by Muslims, as if that's a bad thing. It just happened to be that these are Muslim communities and they were serving themselves, rather than the kind of archaic teaching model, which is a sort of very colonialist setup, where you've got a bunch of white people like me teaching a bunch of brown kids, which understandably that as a model never really worked very well, because you haven't got people who are representative, you know, of the kids representing themselves back to them. You know, you've not. So that was the kind of context of me teaching in Tower Hamlets, and the way that these kind of attacks were made on the schools in Birmingham were through failing the schools for their failing the schools' Ofsted inspections, or getting the schools to fail their Ofsted inspections, because they weren't implementing the prevent counter-terrorism strategy. And at the time, the school I was teaching in Tower Hamlets, we also didn't implement the prevent counter-terrorism strategy. It was a voluntary strategy. I would argue, based on the legislation, still it's a voluntary strategy, but people are so scared they feel forced to do it. And the prevent strategy, for people that don't know, is the strategy. It's a counter-extremism strategy for supposedly spotting potential terrorists before they become terrorists. I've lost what the question actually was.
We were eventually routing our way back to sort of like Carl Jung and why now is the time.
Oh yeah, why for the activism? Yeah. So I have gone a long way back now. So I started pushing back against this, because we felt within the school I was teaching in that it was totally inappropriate for teachers to be pointing the finger at kids and referring them to the police, to ultimately end up in the criminal justice system, which is what the purpose of prevent is. Although it's all dressed up by the Home Office, and this is about care and protection, and which is utter nonsense, because the number of kids that I've worked with to support, and families whose lives have been ruined by being implicated with this strategy, and so that led me over the years. The school I was in, the government started briefing against the schools in Tower Hamlets, saying that there was a Trojan Horse 2 going on in Tower Hamlets where I was teaching. And I suppose the reason I'm getting into this is that this was really my kind of shift from, I was always involved in union politics within schools. I was at rep for our teachers union and that kind of stuff. So I was involved in kind of workplace politics. But this drew the stuff around prevent drew me into kind of, I guess, more national political realm, where I started speaking out about prevent. I happened to be doing my master's in education at the time, and so that gave me a space to kind of do some actual research into what the hell was going on. And so I started speaking out against prevent. And because no one was really speaking out against it at the time, and the main reason for that is that the only people that knew about it were largely Muslims, And if in the climate of the time, most Muslims wisely were not raising their heads above the parapet and complaining about this thing. So I was in a kind of privileged position of being like, I was in a minority as a white teacher in the school I was in. I had a full kind of view of what was going on, and I guess it's kind of, I regard it as kind of a responsible use of white privilege. If you see something and you can speak out, then that's a good opportunity. So I spent a few years doing kind of regular kind of news interviews about Prevent, speaking to parliamentary committees about Prevent and that kind of stuff, just kind of getting myself in as much as I could to kind of try and offer this alternative narrative that this policy that the government says is about caring and looking after people is perhaps not exactly what it's cracked up to be. And so I was doing that for 10 years or so. And thankfully over time, like more and more people got involved, and it built in. There is definitely now a field of people who are challenging this. And, you know, I met other people who were doing the same as me, and we kind of coalesced into there are academic conferences around this and stuff like that. And fantastic organizations like Cage and Prevent Watch and you know, that have been involved in challenging this stuff as well, and are carrying on like that. And I suppose what led me to Jung is to not putting too fine a point in it, but me putting myself into that position of kind of feeling that I had this responsibility to challenge this kind of government-led Islamophobia, this kind of very powerful multi-million-pound industry that was training. I mean, we're training upwards, or certainly above 10 million people in the country have been trained in how to spot extremists through the Prevent strategy. So this is a massive, massive industry, and I'd kind of responsibilized myself to challenge that. And of course, I wasn't going to change that juggernaut. I wasn't going to shift the direction of that oil tanker. And so ultimately, it just led to me having a massive mental health breakdown, because I couldn't carry on doing that. And I think I want to say that it's not a total failure, though, because actually what I discovered through that journey was that I thought for 10 years that I was trying to change a government policy. What I actually did was I created a group of people to provide support for other people who were affected and impacted by it, which I think was on an individual basis seems to be a really powerful thing to have done. And I think that's maybe the thing that we can achieve, is providing this kind of solidarity and an area of safety for people in these dark times. And so my last book that we previously spoke about, Love in the Market, or Love and the Market, was kind of what initially came out of that breakdown of me just sort of being totally overwhelmed. What the fuck am I going to do now? My brain doesn't work. I can't. It's just too scrambled. And part of that driving myself to that point was being amongst other activists and, you know, other left-wing activists, other leftists, who would often say, if they'd like see me speaking or on a panel or even just having a chat with other people, they'd be like, keep angry, stay angry. There's this like mantra that you often see amongst leftists of stay angry.
Yeah.
And you can't stay angry in perpetuity. It just, like, as I found, you just end up, your brain collapses. You can't do it. And so the Love in the Market book I was really fortunate to have a university research fellowship at the time, which gave me a year to bring in a lot of my previous thinking and a lot of other writing that I'd done before and bring it into this book. And I think there's something really therapeutic in the act of writing, just being able to sit there and write. And I think, and I do, when I write a book, I try and get into the kind of, you know, people use as a sort of therapeutic tool. You kind of just do sort of free writing, just kind of keep writing and see what comes out. And when for me, when writing is working, that's what happens. It's just, you just let it out. And I think, and for my book, Love in the Market, I don't know if you remember this from reading it, but it ends up with me talking about the crows on the hill behind our house, and talking about the metaphor for them as shadows and having to look after our shadows. And that imagery for me came up without having any knowledge of Carl Jung whatsoever, because I think the idea of a crow as a shadow, and the idea of a shadow of ourselves and those dark aspects of our psyche, is archetypal. That's just a human experience that if we kind of give it enough space to come out, and maybe if we have those kind of difficulties in our life, we appreciate that there are these other sides to ourselves. And so that, for me, that was a kind of starting point of that. And then the book ultimately came out when I was talking with you and Mike on a podcast on the Acid Left, and we started talking about Jung. And by that point was probably a couple of years after I'd written the book, and I did have this developing understanding of Carl Jung. And Mike said, "Oh yeah, well, Revol would like a book on Jung," and I wasn't ready for it then, so I kind of went away, just sort of let that idea percolate for a while. And yeah, the more I thought about it, the more I thought that this really is the time for a book like this, because there are, particularly within kind of climate activism, which I was always on the fringes of, kind of around like Climate Camp in the early noughties and stuff like that I was involved in, and sort of did my fair bit of time of getting beaten up by the police at protests and things like that. And there have been quite a few people writing about their own kind of mental health struggles in the context of that. And I think, and I could really relate to that. There's a lot of people talking about engaging in these kind of activist struggles. What initially happens is that you either join or you create a community, and you feel kind of enlivened and invigorated, and this is great, and we're moving forward. And then quite quickly you realize that you're not fucking changing the policy, that the government is still going to open up new oil fields in the North Sea. They're going to whatever. They're just not, like, our politicians are totally corrupt, and increasingly so. And so there's got to be another way. There's got to be another approach to this. And I think also in the context of us, and this is what I write about, one of the things I write about in the book, in how we're constantly stymied at the moment by culture wars, because you make any political point, and this happens in our, like, we live in a village in the middle of nowhere, and I've tried to raise some issues at the parish council, and this happens at every level. It happens on social media, it happens in parliament, it happens wherever. And what Jung calls enantiodromia, and apologies if I've mispronounced that, but is the inevitability that we fuel those things that we stand in opposition to. And he tends to talk about it as an internal process. So, like, if you try and repress that aspect of yourself, and in fact, the perfect example of this is how Grindr goes mental whenever there's a Republican convention. It's like all these repressed conservative men who are closet gays. Like that would be like a prime example of this. But it also happens out in the world. It's like it happens in the world of the projections from us. And other people have written about this. Like someone I've talked about in most of my books is Ram Dass, or Born Richard Alpert, who is the kind of one of the four founders of hippie culture, like brought acid to the world, really, along with Timothy Leary. And he writes about how in the 60s the hippies create the police, the police create the hippies. And I just got to this point of realizing that fighting these like activist struggles, like staying angry, I don't think was getting anywhere. And so I'm not against fighting battles, but I think that idea of just staying angry, staying in battle mode the whole time, which seemed to be the activist culture that I was coming from, doesn't seem to achieve anything. It embeds the culture wars. It increases division. It means that you become, you just become a foil to the thing you're trying to oppose and increase it. And I think like there's we're starting to see alternatives emerging in the States at the moment, because there's this like absolute necessity to find an alternative form of activism and opposition, with like the kind of the bringing absurdity to ICE, like the people dressed up as giraffes and all that kind of stuff. You know, maybe that there's an alternative kind of form of theatrical approach there. And I think in the context of Jung, so what does Jung say is, or what is my feeling of Jung? I feel if you, by adopting a Jungian position, is to learn how to step out of that anger, how to step out of the emotions, how to be witness to the emotions. So you can say, I can see the emotion, I can see there's a lot of anger there, and either I can, this is in very simple terms, either I can ask that anger just to step aside so I can be a good dad to my kids, so I can be a good friend to other people, so I can offer care, or I can choose to let the anger in and go, I'm going to use this now to do this. And I think that's what Jung brings to this. It's not a total retreat. It's a stepping back, so that you can then take a broader view and decide what you're going to do and what you're going to do to be effective politically. And I think that's what I'm trying to bring with this book, is that whether it's Jung or any other form of the increasing kind of individualized therapy that people are engaged in, it potentially leads to a retreat from activist politics. And that's like the classic kind of shift to the right that people go through in their middle age, I think is about that. It's learning through, you know, what we would call a midlife crisis, Jung might call a negredo or a mortifico, is learning to retreat so that you can protect yourself. But what I want to bring into this is learning to retreat so you can protect yourself and know how to act better, which I think in a classic kind of therapeutic context, knowing how to act better is missed out, because that's not generally the interest of the therapist. They just want to see you safe and protected here in the room, which probably engenders more retreat than actually working out what to do now, which I think is absolutely vital in the current context.
Yeah, so yeah, it brings you back to, I think you were saying, sort of being in the room, like being back to a level where you can be effective without facing that kind of burnout.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating that you're coming at it from this approach of activist burnout. And I know what you're saying about the stay angry thing. Like it's not necessarily something that's going to have an effect on anyone but your own psyche. Yeah, that's really fascinating.
And I think there's also with that stay angry, there is also a natural progression here that and Jung writes about this, that when we're young, we've got the energy to do that. Like when I was 15 years ago, I could go and take part in a protest late in, I remember this happened on a number of occasions. I could take part in a protest, be kettled until 2 a.m, get kicked out by the police. I'd go home, have a shower, and I'd go back to work as a teacher. I'm now in my mid-40s. There is absolutely no chance I could do that, and so it's just like you then have to kind of work out a different way. So I think that's an important point to make, that there is probably a place. I think there is a place for people to be angry and stay angry, but you know, maybe just kind of offer them some understanding that they might need to just keep an eye on themselves and kind of look after themselves, because certainly when this kind of crisis hit me, like severe burnout, I was fucked. Like it's you know, it's a bad thing to go through, and something I only just survived.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I think we'll return to that sort of therapeutic aspect to this. One thing I wanted to ask you about, and you're quite keen to sort of underline this at various points in the book, is, you know, Jung is a figure who has been embraced by conservatives and the right in the past, and who, you know, some of his views he was writing a long time ago now, you know, might be considered problematic. So what's the value of sort of resurrecting or rehabilitating him for the left?
Yeah. I think it's it's the classic example of this is like, do you denounce and discount Wagner's music because of his anti-Semitism?
Yeah.
And I just no. I just think that's nonsense. I think the important thing here is to rehabilitate the work, and not necessarily rehabilitate the man. Although I don't go in for Jung as an out and out terrible person. I think that his some of his views on race are of a time, but I also go into that in my last book, talk about how the views of the time is not an acceptable excuse, because there have always been people who've offered care and respect and consideration. So I think I don't want to sort of wholly try and rehabilitate Jung the man, but ultimately his the things that he's bringing up, this idea of deep psychology, this idea that we can have a conversation with our psyche that is deeper than our consciousness. He was very, very fully aware of the fact that he was rediscovering this in a kind of post-Enlightenment context. So if you go back, through to kind of, well, we talked about this before. If you go back to like the Enlightenment, so pre-Enlightenment thinking, which was perhaps more magical and dreamlike than how we think in a modern way now. The way that the world would have, pre-witch trials, when the witch trials basically tortured people out of being allowed to think differently. And then even the medieval church. There's a brilliant book called I think it's called The Sacking of the Altars, which is about the medieval church in England, and how the medieval church presents this worldview of angels and demons and something that is very Jungian, where you've got all of these different figures, and it looks far more like modern day Hinduism, if anything, of having these, and even in its aesthetic, you have these very colorfully painted church interiors with different entities that are kind of guiding your life. And from a Jungian perspective, all of those entities are projections of the psyche. And he then takes this further back. His big interest was in alchemy, in kind of medieval alchemy, which is where these early chemists really were doing these chemical experiments where they tried to create perfect conditions to repeat this process, very clearly staged process that might take them days to do these things. That involves heating up magnesium with quicklime and all sorts of different things that would involve like explosions and filling the room with vapors and different colored lights and it's the archetype. The image that you would have is the archetypal view of a mad scientist who's got white hair, by the way, because they're doing so much work with help me out here. What's the metal, the liquid? Mercury. They've all got mercury poisoning, so they're kind of going mad. But what Jung shows is that these stages of the alchemical process that they were all trying to repeat perfectly match the stages that we go through when we experience essentially a mental health crisis, of this kind of, we get a descent into the darkness, then a kind of we find some kind of enlightenment, some kind of mystery is revealed to us, and then we come out with a better understanding. And he's quite interesting writing about that. I don't go into this in depth in the book because there's a whole other book to be written on this, but there's a big question of whether the alchemists knew that this was a projection of the psyche, or whether it was something that they were just living out on externally. I think it's probably something they were just living out externally. And he found through the symbolism that the alchemists were making, which really teased out the symbolism that you're seeing within the Christian church at the time as well. He was able to find some direct connections back to early Christianity, and Gnosticism, which was this kind of early Christianity that was heavily interested in mysticism and dream interpretation, etc. And so I think Jung. The reason I'm saying this is that Jung was rekindling all of this earlier understanding of the psyche that we've then lost, which I now know is absolutely vital for understanding how we function in the world and understanding the world full stop, because it's the way that we get past the kind of projections that we might be putting out into the world. And I think his writing, he's done more than anyone in the last century and a half to bring that way of thinking back to us. But I think what he does is that it's not clear. Perhaps the Gnostics did, but it's not clear that the alchemists or the medieval church, perhaps the witches did, but it's not clear, were aware that all of the symbolism that they were playing with was a projection of the psyche. And from a Jungian perspective, it doesn't really matter whether it is or not. The symbols could be coming from a divine source, or they could be a projection of the psyche. My experience is no different, whichever one it is. So Jung's actually not particularly concerned about that. And from a kind of therapeutic perspective, my work as a therapist, I'm not that interested in whether the client sees it as divine or projection, because actually that's the kind of interesting thing, that you can find healing in either, and equally. But I think he offers us just the best map that anyone offers of how to go about exploring that part of our psyche.
That's fascinating. So it's this idea of understanding the world in order to understand the self, because the self is part of the world. That theme definitely emerges in the book. I wanted to ask you about your therapeutic practice. I mean, another big theme that emerges is the idea of reconnecting with nature. You mentioned the witches who were put on trial, and you kind of paint a picture of them as being people who were more in touch with nature in a direct way. So, you help your clients do this as an ecotherapist using techniques like forest bathing. How did you find your way to that from where you were in terms of working in schools and being quite politically engaged? How did you get to this more sort of nature-centered therapeutic profession?
It's quite a big shift, isn't it, from teaching in a London schools to this. So it's, in a way, I'm kind of going back to my roots, because I grew up on a farm. My dad was a farmer, and so I did. So I spent my whole childhood just in the woods, and that's where I went back to when I had this kind of mental health crisis. I just found I had to be in the woods. I had to be in nature, and I suppose, and I was kind of fortunate at the time that I was, like I said, when it first happened, I was on a university fellowship, and then my wife and I've got 2 kids, and I'm kind of she does a corporate job, and sort of is kind of working much longer hours, so I'm the one that sort of takes up the slack. So my work, and this is why I'm working as a therapist, I'm an author, my work is kind of fitting in as best I can. And there was a time when, before I'd got into any kind of therapeutic practice, I dropped the kids off and I just have to go and sit in the woods. And part of this was down to, I had quite bad, or very bad, long COVID, which just came with this kind of really bad fatigue and terrible anxiety. And I found just the only thing I could really do was just go to the woods and literally crawl into the bushes, just get fully into the earth. And that seemed to provide some kind of relief. And then I found over time, if I found over time, if I did that regularly, so if I did that every day, then I could find kind of enough stability to kind of start getting on with my life again. And so there's really me kind of discovering that for myself. And then I saw that someone basically offered training in what I was doing, and that it was something that you could offer to other people. And I also found, I mean, this is something that you find when if you've been to a kind of dark place mentally, that you suddenly you can see it in other people, and you can, so I found that I was kind of already practicing this, because I mean, the sort of classic example is you get talking to someone in the supermarket queue, and you can immediately see that they're suffering, and you can immediately have a conversation with them on a level that they might not have had with anyone else yet at all. And there's a kind of possibility of kind of real life-saving conversations in those contexts. And so I found that I was starting to take people out just for walks and spend time connecting with nature as well. And then I found this there was this idea that you could actually train in this, and this was something that you could offer to other people. And that came about at about the same time. The farm around the village that I now live in was sold to a new landowner, and this was land that I'd only been here about 5 years, but I'd really connected with it. I knew where the birds were, where the animals were. I knew on a sunny day where I could go and see a snake. I know the land well, and there was this kind of horror that occurred, which was the land had been farmed organically where we are for 36 years. It's one of the longest standing organic farms in the country, and I was worried, this new landowner coming in, that they might not protect the environment in the way that it had been cared for before. And I kind of looked into it and realized that for the landowners to cease being organic, they would have to engage. They'd have to have a 2-year local consultation to get the opinions of the local community to establish whether they're going to change the regime. And on day one of taking ownership of the place, their tractors came in and sprayed weed killer everywhere and basically killed everything. There's one field in particular that had been. We have chalk downland near us, which all around here, which is some of the most species diverse habitats in the planet. And there was a field that was reverting from being cropped into downland. And in the 5 years that we've been here, I'd been watching this field and watching different orchids come up and different species appear, and just this and that's an amazing thing to watch. Nature does rebuild itself. And I came around a corner one day on a walk, and it had gone yellow, and there was a stench of weed killer, and they just killed it off, and I just fell on my knees and was crying. It was horrific. I think this podcast, I'm gonna now go into psychedelic weirdness, if that's all right. Can we do that?
I actually had a question about psychedelic weirdness.
So
by all means.
So I'm despairing. I don't know what to do, and it's just horrific. It's just another utter. It's a perfect example, this of mind and nature being, you know, reflecting and mirroring each other, that gets destroyed. That field that I've been looking and I've been healing alongside then gets destroyed. I'm destroyed again. And it was horrific. And so something I sometimes do, I haven't done it for a while actually, but I sometimes will do a psilocybin trip, magic mushroom trip, by myself with an eye mask on, listening to a playlist, and just as this incredible therapeutic tool that allows me to just get out when you're overwhelmed by something like that and you just can't think about anything else. You're totally like motorway thinking on that. You can't get out of it. You're stuck. A psychedelic trip and the kind of brain scans of people on psychedelics show this, that it opens up all of these connections in your brain when you're thinking on one thing like that, which is basically how depression works. A brain scan will show that you've got like 2 points in your brain are just like talking to each other incessantly, and that's the experience of thinking like that. And when you have a psychedelic trip, it's like, you see the brain scans of people, and suddenly there's this network of connections, and the experience of the subjective experience of that is that suddenly you have options. Suddenly you can think about ways of engaging with this. Suddenly you can think about just things that you hadn't conceived. You make connections. One night when I had a trip like that, I almost inevitably end up late at night if I have a trip. I'll normally do it like early evening. I almost inevitably end up on the hill up there behind our house where there's an ancient long barrow that's like a 5,000-year-old burial mound. And yeah, I just always end up there kind of after the, sort of at some point in the trip. And I was heading up that way, and I ended up going through this. I ended up trespassing across this field that had been killed, and I just ended up it was pouring with rain. It was a full moon, and I was like just kneeling in the mud, and there was this like dead, rotting grass because it had all been killed. And I just at that time thought, I just remember thinking to myself, I need to do what I can. In fact, I'm gonna lean into the weirdness of this. It wasn't that. I had a conversation with the land, with my fingers in the earth, and I pledged to do what I could to protect it. And I think and I then kind of spent the next few hours just kind of roaming over that land and connecting with other trees and things, and which is again is something that like there's a lot of research recently, and particularly psilocybin does engender this deep nature connection. So there's kind of this is a common theme that people experience, and I think that this comes back to the earlier part of this conversation. I think for me that is the way I came to understanding that there's an alternative to this kind of oppositional politics that is going to just fuel the other side, and especially out here in the countryside where the culture wars are so rife within rural communities that if you mention anything about protecting the environment or about ecology, you're likely going to encourage someone to destroy something. It's just a really toxic environment, and so and I think that's one of the things I've come to. So I found with the ecotherapy, like not only can I help people to heal themselves, but helping people to develop this deep connection to nature feels to me like that's the way forward. And I think I'm accepting that this is something that I'm going to do on quite a small scale. Maybe it builds. I hope it builds, but there are certainly the rate at which people are training at doing the work that I'm doing is exponential. I've been helping out training some people more recently, so there are a lot of people doing this. There are a lot of people interested in it, and I think that is probably that's what I can do, because like I said, engaging with kind of the parish council at a local level, engaging with local landowners at local level doesn't do anything. So maybe helping people to develop a deep connection to nature. And I suppose what I mean by that deep connection is appreciating that our mind and nature are not separate. And once you have that appreciation, then, well, it's fucking traumatic because you have to accept that you're being constantly assailed and assaulted and hurt. But it also means that that you can't tolerate the harm that's being done to nature. And hopefully, more people appreciate that the closer we get. And the person who just to sort of name drop, the person who's, as I'm looking at, I've got my books up here, so I'm just looking up, but the person whose work is amazing for this is Gregory Bateson, who was a mid-century philosopher. He was an anthropologist. He was a British anthropologist, ended up marrying Margaret Mead, the kind of famous American anthropologist, and then got into developing the systems theory and cybernetics, so the idea of kind of complexity and everything being in these complex systems. And a lot of his work is on this interrelationship between mind and nature and mind and ecology. And yeah, I think that's got to be the way that we think about the world. And there actually is, we're making pretty good progress. I would say as a culture, we're making pretty good progress with this, because the shift that we can see from that is a shift from, over the last century, from biology to ecology. So, Bram, you and I are old enough that all of the biology we were taught at school was basically naming things. We probably had like one lesson on a food web in an ecosystem, but we certainly weren't taught ecology. We weren't taught about the fact that the boundaries between organisms are actually infinitely blurred and it's impossible to fully define what blah, blah, blah. Like, so the fact that we talk that it's become common standard parlance to talk about things ecologically, or just for those that don't know what that means, talk about ecology, use the word, shows that there is this shift happening. So I think we are heading kind of in the right direction, albeit, I mean, it's forever going to feel too slow, but yeah.
No, that's great. I'm glad you connected that sort of psychedelic experience back to politics and how that works, because that's kind of the substance of what I was going to ask you about. I mean, of course, you mentioned Ram Dass earlier. I mean, figures like Ram Dass and Timothy Leary were far from apolitical. Even though they were advocating for work on the self, I was within the broader context of political goals. And certainly some of what you're describing sort of mirrors my own experiences with psychedelic substances and, psilocybin in particular. There's something about the whole approach of that, where, I mean, certainly in Edinburgh, we used to go and pick our own magic mushrooms. We knew the fields in which they grew. We would go up there and we would brew up a tea, and then camp out. And, I definitely have had a therapeutic benefit from those experiences. At one point, I would put it that I was like angry at the city. I was angry at Edinburgh and some of the experiences I'd had there. And while on psilocybin, looking out over that city, I suddenly realized how how ridiculous it was to be angry at a place. I was kind of looking at the city and thinking, well, it is a place that's full of people, and those people, not all of them are going to agree with me politically or personally, but it's still a thing that's grown. It's like, in a sense, the city is part of ecology as well, even if of that. So I think it's for helping you to come to realizations about the interconnectedness of things, and how the rigid boundaries that politics and enlightenment thinking put up in your mind aren't necessarily as categorical as they seem. Where and I think there's a lot to what you're saying as well about sort of like breaking the chains in your mind, between very fixed ideas or like thought patterns. The few days after a psychedelic experience can be quite powerful in terms of the insights that brings you. And of course, the use of things like psilocybin or fly agaric are things that were so they say, incorporated into the practices of witchcraft, although, as you point out in the book, so much of that knowledge was lost.
And actually, a good friend of mine, Rob Dickens, has just written, I haven't got it on the table, but just written, I think it's called Psilocybe Pickers, which is a kind of seminal introduction or seminal history of psilocybin use in the UK.
Yeah.
And actually, I mean, it's quite interesting. What he's shown is that there is no culture of psilocybin taking before the 1970s. That's not to say it wasn't done historically, but I think there's a lot more evidence for fly agaric use than there is for psilocybin. I think it is possible that liberty caps weren't known about at all in history. I don't know. I find it unlikely, but it is possible. But certainly fly agaric would have been used, and actually from fly agaric from a Jungian perspective, fly agaric is a far more relevant tool. I don't know if you've had experiences with fly agaric.
I've never actually done fly agaric, but it's connected to sort of like dreams of flight, right?
Yeah. So it's something that gives you a huge amount of energy. By the way, don't try this at home because you do have to prepare it quite carefully. Otherwise, it's quite dangerous.
Yeah, we should say that for anyone thinking of trying this at home.
Yeah. But yeah, after you've carefully prepared it, and it gives you an immense amount of energy, and then you fall asleep, and you have very, very strong visionary dreams. Yeah, which is, and so from a Jungian perspective, Jung was very wary of psychedelics, which I think actually Jung was right to be wary of psychedelics, because his fear was that psychedelics open us up to the unconscious, and I think I would say that that's kind of irrefutable, that when we take psychedelics, we're opened up to these deeper aspects of ourselves, whether that's through psilocybin, we just have this more revelatory experience, or through fly agaric we have a more visionary experience. Jung worried that might open people up too much to the unconscious and would lead them to becoming lost, which is something that is, I think, is certainly possible. And I would speak to that from my own experience, not of getting lost, but of needing help to find the therapeutic aspects of them. That I started taking psychedelics kind of latterly. I went to university up in Edinburgh, and I probably sat in the same fields as you've sat in, picking psilocybin mushrooms. But then I hadn't touched them for 20 years. And it was only when my doctor tried to convince me to take antidepressants, and I didn't want to do that, that I was quite, because I write about it quite a lot in my last book, so I was quite kind of well versed in the current research on psychedelics and treating depression. So I took some, instead of the antidepressants, I gave myself a trip, which I hadn't done for about 20 years. And I did immediately feel like the darkness of the depression lifted, and I was totally myself again. But the positive effects waned within about a week, and I was back to being depressed. And it took me to be introduced to someone who is a psychedelic guide, who basically worked on the integration. We met, we had a few Zoom calls in the weeks running up to the trip, had the trip, and then had various Zoom calls and ongoing conversation in the weeks afterwards. And that's what all the research at Imperial shows as well, is that you do that integration process, and you can then draw out the positive effects and make them last. So I think there's a kind of, there is quite a thriving kind of underground scene of psychedelic therapy going on in this country.
There is, and that's fascinating, isn't it? Because Alpert, Leary, and people like that really did place the emphasis on the importance of set and setting and having a guide, and it's kind of good to see that coming back into, especially with the opening up of the opportunities for research into these compounds, and and it's something, it's not something I myself do, but I do offer on my website. I do offer to support people with integration. So I have had some people who've
particularly people who've had difficult trips will come and see me, and actually, again, being in the woods and talking through those trips is a really good place to do it, because it's also with my own therapeutic work with people who are sober when they're coming through the woods. We're still trying to connect to the same stuff. It's on a kind of psychotherapy, an ecotherapy session, I'm trying to get someone into the kind of liminal state where stuff in the forest starts getting reflected back to them. Their sort of the stuff, their psyche starts getting reflected back to them, and it's amazing when that happens. Particularly after I've had a few sessions with someone, we suddenly get this kind of what normally happens. Actually, we have this. I know that this shift is happening because it's when I ask a client to lead us to somewhere that they're familiar with, and they get lost. I'm suddenly like, okay, this is the moment that they've opened up, and then when they open up to that, this incredible thing happens where just symbolism starts appearing in the forest. That tree represents this from their past, and we then sort of start often working back through their past, or working through a kind of difficult thing that they may not even know that they're grappling with. So it's a great place to carry out that integration as well, because particularly if someone's in that kind of liminal space in the few days after a trip, then it's a great time to do that kind of work.
Well, that's great. That's absolutely fascinating, and I kind of commend you for having a button on your website that says psychedelics. I'm sure that will become a fruitful.
I've had that page hidden on the website for a while. I've just recently got like, just buck it, and that's going up.
No, that's great. So I want to bring it back to sort of like on the ground politics for a little bit. Obviously, we're living through an era where there's an incredible rise of the far right in the UK and the US. You've been involved in thinking about extremism and terrorism, and you've written about these things. I think like even my sort of gloomy predictions in my own writing, what's happened in the last 2 years has absolutely sort of exceeded that. In terms of American domestic terrorism, the overwhelming majority of the incidents that have happened on American soil are conducted by far right militias and other far right figures. How concerned are you that we as a society are on the wrong path? You've talked a lot about sort of how we could help individuals to find the right path, but how concerned are you about the path that society at large is on?
I'm very concerned, because I think that the kind of corporate for-profit logic that governs everything will destroy the world.
Yeah.
Like, I was having a conversation with a friend the other day, who I was having this conversation with a friend the other day, and I just had to kind of bluntly just say, well, like, it was a friend who works for one of the big tech companies, and was kind of arguing for they're trying to kind of coach their clients to be more constructive with the tech, so it's not just about efficiency and laying people off, and it's about doing more positive stuff and other. And all of that is nonsense. Like, the profit motive in capitalism has to be destroyed. That's like, I don't think that would have used to be a really radical statement. I don't think that is a particularly radical statement now, to say that the corporate and capitalist profit motive is killing the earth, breaking communities, killing people, and it has to be destroyed. But I think that to add some nuance to that doesn't necessarily mean that there needs to be some kind of Leninist revolution. What it means is that you have to have proper regulation of markets. Like, it's not, which actually isn't that radical. You need to have proper taxation, which we know you need to have proper regulation, so that people aren't allowed to destroy everything. So I think they are desperate times. I think the one thing I'm trying not to get drawn into too much at the moment is being too triggered by the Nazi cosplay theatre that Trump is engaging in, because it's awful, but also that's the point of it. Like Rennie Good being shot and then them being able to say that this was a domestic terrorist and just creating all of this, like fanning this culture war. That is the point. That's the point of ICE in the States. And and I think it's worth talking about that because it is coming here. We've got Reform, saying some horrific things, but at the same time, I know there's other awful things, and fuck knows what's going on. Well, the stuff that we hear that's happening to people in ICE detention is horrific, but equally, the rate of deportations. Someone was talking the other day. The rate of deportations under Obama was still higher.
Yeah.
So there is a huge amount of theatre going on here, and I think we need to be careful of being drawn into that. Which comes back to the, like in Portland and wherever else, where there are the people in inflatable costumes dancing with ICE and stuff like that, and humiliating them. I think that's good. I think because it enables us to laugh at what's horrific while also opposing it, which I think is the only option. So as not to be totally overwhelmed. See it as terrible, see it as bad, but also try and make sure it comes across as absurd.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Watson of Revol Press recently wrote about the reluctance of some voices on the sort of intellectual and academic left to get involved in these discussions or offer strong resistance to Trump and other far-right political figures. So it sounds like what you're saying is that stay angry doesn't necessarily work as a tactic against this kind of, as you called it, Nazi cosplay. You think, I guess, that a more situationist sort of undercutting this with activities that celebrate and show joy is just as important as offering this firm resistance.
I think so, and yeah, I think. Well, the fact that you use that word joy, I think, that's something for me that I find it really difficult to find joy these days, and so anything that can help us find joy, I think, is really important. I think joy is in the current context, joy is a really subversive act, and in fact, in the context of just capitalism, full stop, I think joy is a subversive act, so anything that can help other people find joy, I think, is really, really important. I think the other thing to think, and I often think this when I'm writing is how the Nazis cast certain artists as degenerates. They described art as degenerate, and I was talking to a friend of mine who's an artist the other day about this, and there's basically an imperative at the moment to flood the world with degenerate art that would be described as degenerate, like just get this out there, because that's ultimately where it's at. And maybe that's the way of sort of engaging in the culture war is presenting stuff that is not necessarily directly oppositional, but is just painting an alternative picture. Whether that's joyful or absurd or whatever, doesn't really matter. It's just something that's an alternative.
No, that's great, and I think that offers a almost like a route away from the negativity you engender in yourself when you're trying to fight anger and oppression with more anger.
And it's also and I talk a bit in the book quite a lot about the problem of being locked into the attention economy that is just trying to, and I think that is something that's really difficult now, is like, where do we get our news from? Like, we're getting certainly not, most people of our age and below, probably, you know, if you're below 50, you're probably not getting it from like daily news reports. Which, and I happen to agree with what's his name, that guy who's often talking about tax, Rutger Bregman. He writes about how daily news is a total waste of time, and I think I agree with that daily news is a waste of time, because all it's doing is trying to solicit an emotional response from us. I set up an academic project at SOAS, which was teaching academics how to brief Parliament. And so that gave me the time to spend my days reading parliamentary transcripts. I was up to date with everything that was being said in Parliament and in the House of Lords. And that was a great, I mean, I was definitely very well informed then. But I don't think that's feasible for you know, I don't do that now, and I don't think I could do that now, because that's not my job. And so I don't really know what to do really about that. I mean, I maybe actually, now I'm having this conversation with you, maybe it's something that some of the people that I set up that project with, we did talk about, you know, should we be actually turning this into a news source, which maybe something I could look into. But yeah, it's very difficult to know where to get your news from. I think we are becoming increasingly alienated, because and what I mean by that is that we may have a view of stuff that's going on around the world, but it's the stuff that the algorithm has chosen to give to us. Yeah. So the idea of having a reasonably curated view of national or global politics, I don't know how you do that now. And I think that's the biggest political threat that we face now. I think we've already succumbed to that political threat. So we need to find a way out of it. And I don't know what the answer to that is.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's always disturbing when you see you know, vox pops from people at these far right Tommy Robinson rallies, and they're saying, "Oh, I don't listen to the mainstream media. I absorb all my stuff from YouTube." You know, and it's these kind of radicalized channels that do put an emphasis on whether it's conspiracy theories or just a very amped up version of politics.
But that's happening to all of, that's not just them. That's all of us.
Yes, exactly.
We're all experiencing that.
Yeah, we've all become partisan. We're all subject to that sort of algorithmic curation. I don't think I know what's on the other side of that either, whether it's some sort of grand return of sort of liberal journalistic principles, or whether it's that the onus is on us now to find good sources. But we're probably not going to solve it on this podcast.
I suppose one thing is, as you say that though, I mean, one thing I do is pay a subscription to a couple of things, like to Canary, and I can't remember what the other one is. So you actually pay for your news so that you're not getting news that's being delivered by advertising revenue. I think that's probably a start.
It's probably a good place to start. Yeah. Absolutely. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, Rob. I'm sure we could, you know, carry it on for a lot longer. I wanted to sort of finish up by asking you, you know, from your study of Jung for this book, if there was a single simple lesson we could take from Jung's work as people concerned with the state of the world and our ability to sort of live well in it, what would that be?
I think it's I'm going to paraphrase here, but there's a quote that he says that anyone who feels that they want to throw a brick at someone else's head would probably do better to throw it at their own head first. And what he means by that is that if you're feeling emotionally charged to do something in the world, step back. And that's the lesson that I've taken is that, and that doesn't mean that you don't then do the thing that you were being compelled to do, but it's just that always take a step back, try and be a kind of higher witness of that situation before you then choose to act. And I think that what all of his work is about regaining that ability to choose how we act in the world. And that, you know, particularly as you know, rising fascist politics here and abroad I think we need to develop very good choices about how we act, and so that's a start.
Now that's great. I mean, that's quite close to a phrase from Slavoj Žižek that I often return to. He said, "Don't act, think."
Yeah. Yeah.
No, that's great. Okay, great. Well, listen, if you want to learn more about Rob's work, his writing, and his work as an ecotherapist, you can visit his website, which is integratedmindscapes.co.uk. And obviously, we will link to that in the show notes. You can also pre-order Rob's book on Jung, which is called Radical Jung, Emancipatory Politics and the Search for Meaning in the Ruins of Capitalism, right now at revolpress.com. So yeah, thank you, Rob. It's been an absolutely been a pleasure chatting to you.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks for having me on.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. This has been Strange Exiles in collaboration with Revol Press. Hope you all enjoyed the episode. We'll have lots more of these chats with Revol authors, past, present, and future in the coming months. As I was just saying, today's guest was Faure Walker. Keep an eye on revolpress.com for more news about his book, coming in, I believe, May. And remember to follow Revol Press on Substack, where we regularly publish new essays exploring topics like mental health, anti-capitalism, and the history of left-wing thoughts. So I've been your host, Bram E. Gieben. Thanks very much for tuning in. And thank you, Rob. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks very much.